The silent ocean. Late one cold night in the North Atlantic Ocean, the sea looked calm. Too calm. The sky was hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds, and the moon struggled to shine through the endless fog drifting across the dark water. The ocean stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction, empty and silent. Or at least, that's how it appeared. Cutting through the mist was a powerful warship of the United States Navy. The destroyer USS Arleigh Burke, DDG-51. The destroyer moved steadily across the cold Atlantic waters, its powerful engines pushing the steel giant forward through waves that glowed faintly under the ship's navigation lights. Inside the ship, hundreds of sailors worked through the quiet hours of the night watch. Most missions at sea were like this. Long stretches of calm punctuated by moments of sudden tension. Tonight, however, the calm felt unnatural. Standing on the bridge was the commanding officer of the fleet's escort task group, Admiral Katherine Harrington. Among sailors across the Navy, she was known by a different name, the Lady Admiral. She had earned that name through years of service in some of the world's most dangerous waters, from the storms of the Pacific to the tense patrol zones of the Persian Gulf. But tonight, even after decades of experience, something about the ocean unsettled her. She stared out into the endless gray fog surrounding the destroyer. Visibility was almost zero. The sea seemed empty. Yet her instincts told her something was wrong. A suspicious silence. Deep inside the destroyer, sailors worked in one of the most critical rooms on the ship, the Combat Information Center. Known simply as the CIC, it was the brain of the warship. The room was dark except for the glow of radar screens, navigation monitors, and electronic displays. Officers and technicians watched the data carefully, tracking everything in the surrounding ocean and sky. The destroyer was equipped with one of the most advanced naval defense systems ever created, the Aegis Combat System. This powerful system could detect aircraft, missiles, and ships hundreds of miles away. In most situations, nothing could approach a destroyer like this without being noticed. But tonight, the radar screens were empty. One officer studied his display and frowned. "Admiral," he said through the communications channel, "radar picture is completely clear." On the bridge, Lady Admiral Harrington listened quietly. "Repeat that," she said calmly. "Nothing within detection range," the officer replied. "Ocean's clean." She folded her arms slowly. "Too clean," she said. The officer paused. "Mung." Lady Admiral turned back toward the fog-covered ocean. "After 30 years at sea," she said quietly, "I've learned something. When the ocean goes this quiet, something is usually hiding." The first sign. Minutes passed. The destroyer continued its steady course through the fog. Inside the CIC, the crew maintained their watch, scanning their instruments carefully. Then suddenly, a voice broke the silence. "Sonar contact." The sonar operator leaned closer to his screen. "Possible ship movement, bearing 085. The room instantly came alive. Officers gathered around the sonar display as a faint signal appeared on the screen. The signal was weak and inconsistent, almost like something was trying to avoid detection. A young officer studied the data. "Could be fishing vessels," he suggested. Another sailor shook his head. "This far out in the Atlantic?" The sonar operator adjusted his equipment again. The signal flickered. Then it grew slightly stronger. Above them, on the bridge, Lady Admiral Harrington received the report. "Bring the data up to the command screen," she ordered. Moments later, the faint sonar signature appeared on the large display in front of her. She leaned closer. The signal moved slowly across the water. Then another signal appeared. And another. Her eyes narrowed. "These aren't fishing boats," she said. "A fleet in the fog." Within minutes, the sonar system began detecting multiple contacts. 5, then 6, then 8, all moving in formation. Inside the CIC, the tension in the room grew heavier. "Admiral," the sonar officer said, "we have multiple surface contacts. But radar still shows nothing." That was the most disturbing part. Normally, ships this size would appear clearly on radar. But the screens remained empty. Lady Admiral studied the data carefully. Then she spoke the words that made the entire room fall silent. "That's not a fishing fleet." She paused. "That's a war fleet." The officers exchanged worried glances. But how are they invisible to radar? Someone asked. Lady Admiral answered calmly. Stealth. The Ghost Fleet. Across the fog-covered ocean, an unknown fleet had silently approached within striking distance of the destroyer. Their ships were equipped with advanced stealth technology, designed to reduce radar detection. Hull designs that scattered radar waves. Electronic systems that masked their presence. To radar, they appeared almost invisible. But sonar had finally discovered them. Lady Admiral looked around the command center. Sound general quarters. Instantly, alarms echoed through the destroyer. Red lights flashed across the corridors as sailors rushed to their combat stations. The calm night at sea had just turned into a battlefield. And somewhere in the fog surrounding them, an enemy fleet was preparing to attack. Missiles in the fog. The first warning came seconds later. A radar operator shouted from across the room. Missile launch detected. Through the fog-covered darkness, bright flames suddenly erupted across the distant ocean. Anti-ship missiles shot into the sky like streaks of fire. They were heading directly toward the destroyer. Incoming missiles, the officer yelled. Lady Admiral reacted instantly. Activate defensive systems. The destroyer's missile defense batteries prepared for launch. Moments later, the ship fired its own interceptors, the powerful RIM-66 Standard missile. 2 defensive missiles roared into the night sky. Seconds later, 2 bright explosions lit up the fog. BOM. BOM. The first incoming missiles were destroyed. But the battle had only just begun. Surrounded in the mist, the thunder of the explosions still echoed across the dark waters of the North Atlantic Ocean. Fragments from the destroyed missiles rained into the sea like burning metal stars. For a moment, the fog around the destroyer glowed orange from the fireballs in the sky. But the battle was far from over. On the bridge of the USS Arleigh Burke, DDG-51, Admiral Katherine Harrington stood perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the tactical display. The crew called her the Lady Admiral. And tonight, every sailor on the ship depended on her decisions. The second wave. Inside the Combat Information Center, alarms continued flashing as new data poured in through the ship's sensors and satellites. A radar officer suddenly shouted, Admiral, multiple launches detected. Lady Admiral turned sharply. How many? The officer hesitated for half a second before answering. 6, maybe 8 missiles inbound. The room fell silent. Enemy ships hidden in the fog had launched another coordinated strike. This time the missiles were approaching from different directions. The enemy fleet was trying to overwhelm the destroyer's defenses. Lady Admiral immediately gave the order. Engage defensive grid. The powerful Aegis combat system instantly came to life, calculating intercept trajectories faster than any human could think. On the deck of the destroyer, sailors braced themselves as the ship trembled from the force of the launches. Fire in the fog. Seconds later, the sky exploded again. 4 enemy missiles were destroyed in midair, but 2 others slipped through the defensive net. Incoming missile. Range 2 miles, a radar officer shouted. Lady Admiral didn't panic. Activate close defense. Immediately, the ship's rapid-fire defensive cannon, the Phalanx CIWS, began firing. The automated gun rotated toward the incoming missile and unleashed a storm of bullets. Thousands of rounds per minute tore through the fog. Then, a brilliant flash. The missile exploded less than a mile from the ship. A wave of heat and debris slammed into the destroyer, but the ship remained intact. Cheers erupted briefly inside the command center. But Lady Admiral raised her hand. Stay focused. The enemy fleet is still out there. The destroyer moves. The fog surrounding the battlefield had become a strange advantage. Neither side could clearly see the other. But the enemy fleet had numbers. If they attacked from all directions, the destroyer could eventually be overwhelmed. Lady Admiral studied the tactical display carefully. Then she made a bold decision. Helm, she said calmly. Yes, Admiral. Full speed ahead. The officer looked surprised. Straight toward the contacts. Lady Admiral nodded. If we stay still, they surround us. If we move fast, we break their formation. Moments later, the engines of the destroyer roared louder as the ship accelerated through the waves. The steel giant surged forward into the thick fog, straight toward the hidden enemy fleet, the first enemy ship. As the destroyer pushed deeper into the fog, sonar signals became stronger. One enemy vessel was now less than 5 miles away. The silhouette of the ship slowly appeared through the mist. Even in the darkness, its shape looked strange. Sharp-angled surfaces. Low radar profile. A stealth warship. Lady Admiral studied it carefully. Target confirmed. She turned to the weapons officer. Prepare strike. The officer nodded and entered commands into the launch console. Deep inside the destroyer, one of the vertical launch cells opened. A powerful cruise missile prepared for launch. The famous Tomahawk missile. Missile ready, the officer said. Lady Admiral gave the order. Fire. The first kill. With a thunderous blast, the Tomahawk missile shot into the sky. For a moment it disappeared into the fog. Then the guidance system locked onto its target. Seconds later, a massive explosion erupted across the ocean. The enemy stealth ship vanished in a ball of fire. Burning debris fell into the water as flames spread across the wreckage. Inside the destroyer, sailors watched the explosion on their screens. One enemy ship had been destroyed. But the sonar operator suddenly shouted again. Admiral, multiple new contacts. Lady Admiral looked at the display. More ships were approaching. The Ghost fleet had realized they were under attack. Now they were moving to surround the destroyer. The trap. Within minutes, enemy ships began closing in from 3 directions. Missile launch warnings echoed through the command center again. The enemy fleet was firing everything they had. The ocean around the destroyer lit up with streaks of fire as missiles cut through the fog. Lady Admiral watched the tactical display carefully. Intercept all targets, she ordered. The RIM 66 standard missile batteries launched again. Explosions filled the sky, but the number of incoming weapons kept increasing. One officer spoke quietly. Admiral, they're trying to overwhelm us. Lady Admiral nodded. Yes. She studied the screen again. Then she noticed something strange. One section of the enemy formation was weaker. Only 2 ships guarded that direction. Her eyes sharpened. That's our escape route. Breaking the Ghost fleet, Lady Admiral turned to the helm officer. Change course. New heading. 310. The destroyer suddenly turned sharply, cutting across the waves. The enemy fleet tried to adjust their positions. But the fog slowed their coordination. Now the destroyer was racing directly toward the weakest part of the formation. Weapons officer shouted. Targets locked. Lady Admiral gave the command. Fire everything. Missiles launched one after another. Explosions erupted across the ocean. One enemy ship burst into flames. The second vessel tried to retreat into the fog. But another missile struck its side. The blast lit up the fog like lightning. The path ahead was now open. The destroyer had broken through the enemy formation. A new threat. Just as the crew began to breathe again, the sonar operator froze. His eyes widened. Admiral. Lady Admiral looked at him. What is it? His voice was tense. I'm detecting something below us. Below? She asked. Yes, ma'am. The sonar screen showed a moving object deep beneath the ocean. Its sound signature was unmistakable. The operator swallowed. Enemy submarine. The room fell silent again. The Ghost fleet had one final weapon. And it was already in attack position beneath the destroyer, the submarine ambush. Cold wind swept across the dark waters of the North Atlantic Ocean as the destroyer USS Arleigh Burke, DDG-51, pushed through the thick fog at full speed. The ship had just broken through the outer formation of the mysterious Ghost fleet. Burning wreckage of enemy ships floated behind them in the dark ocean. For a moment, it seemed like the destroyer had escaped the trap. But deep inside the Combat Information Center, the sonar operator stared at his screen with growing fear. A signal had appeared beneath the ship. A moving signal. And it was getting closer. Something beneath the ocean. Admiral. The sonar officer said quietly. Lady Admiral Katherine Harrington turned toward him. What do you have? The young sailor pointed at the screen. There's a contact below us. The display showed a faint but unmistakable sound signature moving through the deep ocean. It wasn't a surface ship. And it wasn't debris. It was something far more dangerous. A submarine, the officer said. The room instantly became silent. A submarine hidden beneath the ocean was the most dangerous enemy a surface warship could face. And this one had likely been waiting for them. The hunter in the deep. The sonar system began analyzing the sound signature carefully. Every submarine produced a unique acoustic fingerprint created by its engines, propellers, and internal machinery. The computers compared the signal with known databases. Then the result appeared on the screen. The sonar operator spoke again. "Admiral, this isn't just any submarine." Lady Admiral crossed her arms. "What is it?" The officer looked nervous. "Signature indicates a stealth attack submarine. The kind of submarine designed specifically to hunt destroyers." Deep below the ocean surface, the unseen predator moved silently toward its target. Waiting, calculating, preparing to strike. Torpedo launch. The warning came suddenly. A sonar alarm screamed through the Combat Information Center. Torpedo in the water. Every officer in the room turned toward the display. A high-speed torpedo was racing through the ocean directly toward the destroyer. Range: less than 2 miles. Lady Admiral reacted instantly. Deploy countermeasures. The crew launched underwater decoys designed to confuse incoming torpedoes. At the same time, the destroyer began a sharp evasive maneuver, turning hard to the starboard side. The massive ship leaned slightly as it changed course at high speed. Everyone on board could feel the tension. A torpedo strike could break the destroyer in half. The first explosion. Seconds later, a deep underwater explosion shook the ocean. The torpedo detonated after striking one of the decoys instead of the ship. The shockwave rolled beneath the destroyer, causing the hull to vibrate. But the ship survived. Inside the command center, sailors exhaled in relief. Lady Admiral remained calm. "That submarine is still out there," she said. "And it will fire again." Hunting the submarine. Now the situation had reversed. Instead of being hunted, the destroyer needed to become the hunter. Lady Admiral turned toward the sonar team. "Track that submarine." The sonar operators adjusted their systems, trying to isolate the faint underwater sounds. The submarine was moving carefully, changing depth, changing direction, trying to remain hidden in the deep Atlantic waters. But the destroyer had powerful detection equipment designed specifically for this mission. The advanced sonar array began scanning the ocean again. One of the most effective weapons in the U.S. Navy arsenal, the Mark 54 torpedo. Weapons officers quickly programmed the torpedo with the submarine's last known position. "Target locked," the officer reported. Lady Admiral didn't hesitate. "Launch." The torpedo dropped into the ocean and activated instantly. Its powerful sonar sensors began searching for the enemy submarine. Then it accelerated forward through the dark water. The hunt had begun. Underwater duel. Deep beneath the waves, the enemy submarine detected the incoming torpedo. Its crew immediately tried to evade. The submarine dove deeper into the ocean. Decoys were launched to confuse the weapon. But the Mark 54 torpedo was designed to ignore simple tricks. It adjusted its course, locked onto the submarine's engine noise, and continued chasing its target. Above the surface, sailors aboard the destroyer watched the sonar screen anxiously. The torpedo signal was closing in. Closer, closer. Then suddenly, the signal disappeared. For a moment nobody spoke. Then the sonar operator shouted. "Explosion detected." A powerful underwater blast erupted deep beneath the ocean. The shockwave rippled across the water's surface. The enemy submarine had been destroyed. The ocean falls silent. For several seconds the entire command center remained quiet. Then slowly, the sonar operator confirmed the result. No further submarine contacts. Cheers erupted inside the destroyer. The Ghost Fleet had lost its hidden predator. Lady Admiral allowed herself a small smile, but she quickly raised her hand. "Stay sharp," she told the crew. "The fleet above us is still out there." She turned back toward the tactical display. Several enemy ships still remained hidden somewhere in the fog, and they were preparing for their final attack. A storm approaches. Outside, the fog had begun to move as strong winds swept across the ocean. The weather was changing rapidly. Lightning flashed across the distant horizon. A powerful storm was approaching the battlefield. The dark ocean was about to become even more dangerous. Lady Admiral looked toward the storm clouds forming in the distance. Then she spoke quietly. "Looks like the Atlantic wants to join the fight." Behind her, sailors prepared their weapons again. The Ghost Fleet had lost its submarine. But the war in the fog was far from over. The enemy admiral. A cold storm was beginning to rise above the dark waters of the North Atlantic Ocean. Heavy clouds rolled across the sky, swallowing the moon and plunging the ocean into deeper darkness. Thunder rumbled in the distance while waves began growing larger, slamming against the hull of the destroyer USS Arleigh Burke, DDG-51. Inside the Combat Information Center, the crew worked with intense focus. They had already destroyed several enemy ships and eliminated the stealth submarine that had tried to ambush them. But the Ghost fleet was not finished yet. Somewhere in the fog, the remaining enemy ships were regrouping, and someone was commanding them. The hidden commander. Nearly 20 miles away, concealed within the stormy fog, a large stealth warship sailed silently through the dark Atlantic waters. Unlike the other ships in the fleet, this vessel was heavily armored and equipped with advanced command systems. This was the flagship of the Ghost fleet. Standing inside its command bridge was the man responsible for the entire operation, Admiral Viktor Sokolov, a veteran naval commander known for his ruthless tactics and brilliant strategic mind. He studied the tactical display showing the burning wreckage of several ships that had been destroyed by the American destroyer. His officers waited nervously for his reaction. One of them spoke quietly. "Admiral, we've lost 3 ships and the submarine." Sokolov's expression remained calm. "Expected losses," he replied. The officer looked surprised. "You expected this?" Sokolov nodded slowly. "The American destroyer is commanded by Katherine Harrington." He tapped the screen where the U.S. ship was displayed. "She is not an ordinary commander." Even enemy intelligence respected the reputation of the woman, known as the Lady Admiral. But Sokolov had not come unprepared. The real plan, the attack by the Ghost fleet, had never been meant to destroy the destroyer quickly. Instead, it was meant to test its defenses, to study its reactions, to weaken it slowly. Sokolov turned toward his weapons officer. "Prepare the final phase." The officer immediately understood. "Hypersonic strike?" Sokolov nodded. "Yes." Unlike normal missiles, hypersonic weapons traveled at incredible speeds, faster than 5 times the speed of sound. They were extremely difficult to intercept. On the deck of the stealth flagship, massive missile launch cells began opening. Inside them waited the fleet's most powerful weapons. The storm clouds above the ocean rumbled with thunder, and the final attack was about to begin. Back on the destroyer, on board the USS Arleigh Burke, DDG-51, Lady Admiral Katherine Harrington watched the tactical display carefully. The ocean around them remained covered in thick fog, and radar detection was still limited. But something about the enemy's movements felt unusual. "They're regrouping," she said quietly. The radar officer looked confused. Why would they wait? Lady Admiral thought for a moment. Because they're preparing something bigger. At that exact moment, the radar console suddenly flashed red. The officer shouted, "Multiple launches detected." The entire room froze. "How many?" Lady Admiral asked. The officer's voice trembled slightly. No, 6 missiles. But these missiles were different. Their speed readings were off the charts. Lady Admiral's eyes widened slightly. Hypersonic weapons, a race against time. The powerful Aegis combat system immediately began calculating interception solutions. But hypersonic missiles moved incredibly fast. The crew had only seconds to react. Lady Admiral turned toward the weapons officer. "Launch interceptors immediately." Missile launch cells opened across the deck. Defensive interceptors fired into the stormy sky. Lightning flashed above the battlefield as the missiles streaked through the clouds. Inside the command center, everyone watched the tracking screens. Seconds passed. Then the first explosion appeared. One hypersonic missile had been destroyed. Then another. But the remaining missiles continued racing toward the destroyer. "2 missiles still inbound," the radar officer shouted. The distance was closing fast. The entire crew knew the truth. If even one of those missiles struck the ship, the battle would end instantly. The Lady Admiral's gamble. Lady Admiral stared at the tactical display. Then she made a decision. "Hard turn. Port side." The helm officer reacted instantly. The destroyer turned sharply, waves crashing against the hull as the ship changed direction. At the same time, the ship's final defensive system activated again, the Phalanx CIWS. The automated cannon rotated and opened fire. Thousands of rounds poured into the sky. The first hypersonic missile entered the defensive range. Bullets struck it repeatedly. Then, a massive explosion lit up the storm. 1 missile destroyed. But the final missile continued descending through the clouds. The distance was less than a mile. The ship's cannon fired relentlessly. Then suddenly, a bright flash erupted above the destroyer. The last missile exploded in the air, only seconds before impact. The crew stared at the screen in disbelief. They had survived. The final battle approaches. Inside his flagship, Admiral Sokolov watched the missile strike results. His expression remained calm. "Interesting," he said. One of his officers asked nervously, "What are your orders now, Admiral?" Sokolov slowly smiled. Now we finish this. He turned toward the tactical display showing the American destroyer. Bring the fleet forward. Through the storm and fog of the Atlantic Ocean, the remaining ships of the Ghost Fleet began moving again. This time they weren't hiding. They were coming for a direct battle. Back aboard the destroyer, Lady Admiral Harrington watched the same movement on her screens. The enemy ships were closing in. The final confrontation was about to begin. She looked around at her crew. All right, she said calmly. Let's end this. The final naval war. Thunder rolled across the stormy skies above the North Atlantic Ocean. Waves crashed violently against the steel hull of the destroyer USS Arleigh Burke, DDG-51, sending white spray across the dark ocean. The fog that had hidden the enemy fleet for hours was slowly breaking apart as powerful winds from the storm pushed it away. For the first time that night, the battlefield was becoming visible. Inside the Combat Information Center, the tactical screens showed a new development. The remaining ships of the Ghost Fleet were no longer hiding. They were moving straight toward the American destroyer. The final battle had begun. The enemy advances. Radar signals began appearing clearly on the display. 1, 2, 3, 4 enemy warships were closing in from different directions. At the center of their formation was the largest ship of them all, the command flagship of Admiral Viktor Sokolov. Lady Admiral Katherine Harrington studied the tactical screen carefully. Her crew stood ready around her. The storm outside made the ocean violent, but the destroyer remained steady. Distance, she asked. 10 miles and closing, the radar officer replied. Lady Admiral nodded slowly. They're coming in for a direct fight. For hours, now they were abandoning those tactics. They wanted to overwhelm the destroyer with a final coordinated strike. Preparing the fleet killer. Weapons officers quickly prepared the ship's long-range strike weapons. Inside the vertical launch system, multiple cruise missiles were ready to fire. Among them were the famous Tomahawk missile weapons capable of striking enemy ships from many miles away. But Lady Admiral did not give the launch order yet. Instead, she waited. The enemy ships continued moving closer through the storm. 7 miles. 6 miles. Lightning flashed across the dark ocean, briefly illuminating the silhouettes of the approaching warships. Finally, the radar officer spoke again. 5 miles. Lady Admiral turned toward the weapons officer. Target the lead ships. Locked, he answered. She took a deep breath. Fire. Missiles across the ocean. With a thunderous roar, several missile launch cells opened at once. Tomahawk missiles blasted into the sky, leaving bright trails of fire as they disappeared into the storm clouds. Seconds later they descended toward their targets. The enemy fleet reacted quickly. Defensive weapons opened fire as their own missiles launched in response. The sky above the North Atlantic exploded into chaos. Missiles streaked in both directions. Explosions lit up the storm like flashes of lightning. Inside the destroyer's command center, the tactical screens filled with moving symbols and warnings. Then the first strike landed. A massive explosion erupted across one of the enemy warships. Flames shot high into the air as the vessel slowed and began listing to one side. Enemy ship disabled, the radar officer shouted. Cheers broke out briefly among the crew, but the battle was far from over. Enemy counterattack. Admiral Sokolov's fleet responded immediately. Multiple anti-ship missiles launched from the remaining vessels. The radar alarm screamed again inside the destroyer, for missiles inbound. Lady Admiral remained calm. Intercept. The RIM-66 standard missile defense system launched several interceptors. Moments later the sky filled with explosions as the incoming missiles were destroyed one by one. But one missile slipped through the defensive line. Incoming. Range 1 mile, the officer shouted. The final defensive weapon activated instantly, the Phalanx CIWS. The rapid-fire cannon unleashed thousands of rounds into the air. The missile exploded just seconds before reaching the ship. The shockwave shook the destroyer, but it held its course. Closing the distance. The storm grew stronger. Rain began pouring across the battlefield. But the fight continued. 2 remaining enemy ships attempted to flank the destroyer from the sides, while the flagship advanced from the front. Lady Admiral quickly analyzed the situation. They're protecting their command ship, she said. If we destroy that flagship, the rest will collapse. She turned toward the weapons officer. Target the command vessel. The officer hesitated. It's heavily defended. Lady Admiral nodded. That's why we hit it first. Strike on the flagship. Another missile launch sequence began. 2 Tomahawk missiles fired almost simultaneously. They flew low across the ocean surface, avoiding radar detection until the final seconds. On board the enemy flagship, alarms began sounding. Admiral Sokolov watched the approaching missiles on his display. "Intercept them," he ordered calmly. Defensive guns fired. One missile exploded in midair, but the second missile continued flying. Seconds later, a massive explosion struck the side of the flagship. Flames erupted across its deck as smoke poured into the stormy sky. The ship slowed dramatically. Inside the destroyer, the crew watched the damage appear on their screens. "Direct hit," the radar officer shouted. "The end of the Ghost fleet." The remaining enemy ships hesitated. Without their flagship coordinating the attack, their formation began breaking apart. Some ships attempted to retreat into the storm. Others continued firing randomly. Lady Admiral seized the moment. "Finish it." Missiles launched again from the destroyer. Explosions lit up the ocean as the last enemy vessels were struck. One by one, the remaining ships of the Ghost fleet were destroyed or forced to flee. Finally, the radar screens became quiet again. No more hostile contacts. Only storm clouds and empty ocean remained. Silence after the battle. The rain slowly began to fade as the storm moved east across the Atlantic. Burning wreckage floated across the dark water, where the Ghost fleet had once sailed. Inside the command center, exhausted sailors stared at their screens in disbelief.